Shortly after I had turned 18, back in the early 2000s, I got a job at the local movie rental place to help pay for my college. I worked there for about 2 years, and during that time had been promoted to hold keys to the store and open and close the registers. This also meant that I was occasionally working by myself for short periods of time. One such morning, I was going through the morning procedures and putting returned movies back on the shelves. I was accustomed to greeting every customer no matter what, not only as a friendly gesture but as a part of the loss prevention protocol. Anyway, this particular morning I was taking the movie cart around and reshelving the movies, and I heard the door ding on the other side of the store. So I greeted whoever it was with my voice raised. "Hi, how are you today?" Normally they would give back a reply, but I didn't get one this time. So I'm looking between the shelves for the person that came in, and I see a middle-aged, balding man looking around. He seemed normal at first, but didn't really say anything when I asked him the next 2 times if he needed help. He pretty much ignored me. So I went about my business while keeping an eye on him. He was starting to make me nervous because he wasn't really looking at anything, just kind of making it look like he was looking at what was in front of him, when his attention was focused elsewhere, seemingly at the ceiling. So I decided to give it one more try to let him know that I was wondering what he was doing. "Can I help you find anything?" I asked as I walked past him to put a movie away. At this point, he had been in the store for nearly 20 minutes. He responded in such a way that made it clear that there was something off in his mind. Facing me but with his eyes averted from my gaze, he says in a startling loud voice, "Oh, just browsing." So I politely said, "Okay, just let me know if I can help you with anything," and I went about my duties. He left shortly after this, at which point I let out a sigh of relief. A few days went by and I was opening by myself again. I went to start shelving the movies when the door dinged, and I again turned to greet whoever it was when I saw the same guy beelining it straight at me. I kind of panicked a little, but I stood my ground, and when he got right up to me, seriously so close that I leaned back away from him, he lifted an open can of nuts and offered, "Cashew?" No thank you," I said. I asked if I could help him find anything, and he didn't answer. He went to the start of the wall where the movies that started with A were located, which was just a few feet to the left of where I was putting up the B and C movies. He was very obviously pretending to look at movie boxes by picking them up and flipping them over and then putting them back. He continued this and shuffled along behind me as I moved down the wall. After a few minutes of this, I got uncomfortable and took the cart to the front counter, at which point he left the store. A few customers came and went, and I went back to shelving the movies. When I was around the M area of the movie wall, Cashew Guy came back and continued his pretend perusal of the movie boxes, always just a few feet to the left of me. So, in the next area of the store, there were shelves that went a bit higher than the rest, and on the very top shelf were the adult movies. There was also a back room that contained some of the harder stuff, but I only went in that room one time right before I quit, just to see what it was like. Anyway, I was shelving the movies with a Cashew Guy near me, not saying anything to me until I get to the adult section. He reached for one of the boxes at the top, which made me shudder, and says to me in a loud and strange voice, "I bet you have one of those big football player boyfriends." Thoroughly creeped out and disgusted, I go straight to the front counter and another male customer walks in. This guy finds what he's looking for and goes to the register. I whispered to the guy that there was a man bothering me and asked if he would stay until the guy left. He shrugged and just kind of stood by the door awkwardly until Cashew Guy walked out. I thanked the guy and he left. I went back to the shelves, and not 5 minutes later, Cashew Guy came back and again tried to engage me in an awkward conversation. I went to the front counter and I called my mom. She and my sisters were out getting lunch, so I told her what was going on, and they brought me something to eat. As soon as I picked up the phone, he left the store. He didn't come back that day. Next door to the movie place was an electronics store that was run by a very nice and talkative man, Mr. Moon, and his wife. I never spoke to his wife, but I knew English wasn't her first language. Mr. Moon would come over and use our shrink wrap machine and talk and make us laugh. One evening after my encounter with the strange man, Mr. Moon came in more serious than normal and warned us about a man that had come in while his wife was working alone, and he was out getting food. The man was walking around picking things up and putting them back down in such a way that made Mrs. Moon uncomfortable. I knew who it was right away. After a while, Mrs. Moon asked if he was going to purchase something, and he picked up a random house phone and asked how much it was. She told him, and he got upset at the price, but he took it to the counter anyway, and when she rang him up, he tried to pay with a crumpled up check from his pocket. She refused to accept the check and he got angry, so she called Mr. Moon to come back and handle the situation. Mr. Moon told the man that the check was suspicious and that they normally wouldn't accept it as payment. Mr. Moon understood that there was something off with this guy and agreed to accept the check on a condition that the man give him a phone number where he could be reached. He told them that if the check bounced, he was going to call them, and the man would have to cover the cost of it all. The man agreed, but Mr. Moon knew that was a bad deal all the way around. He said that after the man left the store, he went and stood in the parking lot and just stared up at the sky for about 10 minutes. He figured by his description that it was the same man who had been bothering me. One day, not long after the above, I go to the movie store to pick my paycheck up, and the girl working tells me that some man came in asking about me. She said that he seemed off, and she said she knew he was talking about me when he referenced my curly hair. It gave me the creeps, but I personally never saw the guy again. I found out why when a few days later Mr. Moon came in saying that, unsurprisingly, the check the man had paid with had bounced. He called the number the man gave him a few times and talked to the man on the phone, each time getting nowhere in the conversation. Mr. Moon did a pretty good impersonation of the startlingly loud, drawling voice. Okay. Anyway, he called one more time and a woman answered. When Mr. Moon had explained the situation, the woman said, "I'm his mother and he's not here anymore. I had him committed and the hospital picked him up this morning." I am and have always been a very small girl, standing at 4'11", full grown now at 27. And I've always been able to pass as being much younger than I am, especially if I'm not wearing any makeup. When I was a small child, about 7 or 8, my father bought a little cabin in a town in Texas called Livingston, in an area of Livingston called Alaska. I specify because of the second part of the story. Anyone with kids needs to be wary of the area. The cabin was really nothing remarkable at only 600 square feet. It was really just one giant room, a teeny kitchen the size of a normal bathroom, and a bathroom the size of a large closet, and a porch out front. The whole property consisted of 2 lots, so there was plenty of space, but the cabin itself was dinky. This whole area was in a strange mix between backwoods and suburbia. It was a true neighborhood, but not the prim and neatly kept neighborhoods I was used to in suburbia Houston. Despite this, it became a very fun place for me, and some of my greatest memories in life are at that cabin, including my evacuation story from Houston during Hurricane Rita. That is a story for another day. Anyways, around 11 to 12 years old, my father bought me a 4-wheeler, and the little lake town suddenly became a lot bigger. I didn't go super far, but I definitely ended up going further than I had ever gone before. And it was quite common to see me zipping up and down the roads with a pile of neighborhood kids on the back of the 4-wheeler when we would go up to the lake house on weekend visits. This was around 2001 to 2002, So cell phones were a thing, but it was still common for people not to have them. Usually I had a beeper that I carried around, but with no phones at the lake house, my father gave me a walkie-talkie with a very long reach instead. Looking back on it now from a world of cell phones, this seemed like a bad idea. This was a small town and we had spent so much time here that it felt safe. So one of these weekends, I was buzzing around my neighborhood like I usually did, and I stopped at this peninsula that overlooked the lake. This was a set of docks that us kids always came to when we wanted to swim, despite the very real threat of giant alligators. But being stupid kids, we really didn't worry about that. And I was overlooking the lake when my walkie-talkie buzzed to life. Naturally thinking it was my parents trying to reach me, I answered quickly. I couldn't quite make out what they said at first, so I tried confirming that it was my dad. At this point in the neighborhood was a little ways away from the cabin, but I had reached my parents from this point before, so despite the fact I could not quite recognize the voice, I assumed it was my dad. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but it was off enough that I remember being slightly annoyed. Garbled questions that I had answered, but no answers that would have hinted at who I was or where I was. Eventually, the conversation started to drift in a way that I knew something was off, but I was not alarmed just yet, as my dad was notorious for pulling pranks on me and goofing around. I kept talking stupidly. Alarm bells weren't going off yet. Finally though, the guy on the other end of the walkie-talkie makes a comment. I cannot for the life of me remember what he said exactly, but it was enough to make me doubt that it was my father. This is when things took an extremely creepy turn. Bear in mind, I had been talking to this guy pretending to be my father for a good 15 minutes, sitting on my four-wheeler on this peninsula. I can see you. You should come take a ride in my boat, he said. My father had a boat, but this was so out of character that it made me realize that it wasn't my father. Dad, you're not Dad, are you? What are you talking about? He said. If you can see me. I started feeling a bit peeved that this guy had been messing with me. What am I wearing? He paused for a second before the walkie crackled to life, and he said very clearly, You're wearing an orange shirt. You have red hair and you're sitting on a red four-wheeler right by the swim docks. Why don't you come for a ride in my boat? At this point, my eyes widened and my blood ran cold. This entire time, some strange guy that I didn't know had been watching me from God knows where. It took me maybe 10 seconds to look around wildly and then kick the four-wheeler up and race out of there so fast that the wheels had a hard time catching the ground. I remember the wheels spun out against the gravel beneath them, and when the four-wheeler finally started moving, little me had a hard time holding on. I floored it the entire way home, stopped in the middle of the yard and burst into the house. Obviously, the first thing I did was ask my parents if they had contacted me, which they had not and hadn't for hours. I was in such a panic that there was no way my dad wouldn't have convinced that it had been him. He was a practical joker, but he knew when the fun was over. I hate to think what might have happened had I continued sticking around the area, or if I hadn't figured out that it wasn't my dad pulling my leg. Nothing came of this incident though, and my childhood up there resumed as normal. Eventually, the weekend visit stopped, but the story doesn't end there. During my parents' divorce, I moved to live at the lake house permanently with my father, or at least until we could find something better. This was the only place that we could go when he left my mother, which is a long story in and of itself, but I won't get into that. My father had recently suffered from health issues, so I took a job at a nearby gas station, tobacco barn, to pay the bills and let him recuperate. Thankfully, the lake house had no bills save for electricity, water, and internet, so my small salary was enough to keep us going. I only worked there for 3 months, but those 3 months were by far the creepiest that I'd ever experienced. Within the first month, a rather tall and obese man became infatuated with me, and he couldn't have been creepier. He had a short crew-cut hair and a slightly unkempt beard and mustache combo. The first time that we ran into each other, he stared at me with these wide, crazy eyes, got his gas, and just stood there for 2 or 3 solid minutes, just staring. When I asked him if I could help him, he said nothing. Now, the part of the tobacco barn I worked in was strictly the gas side, and I was pretty much in a glass box with an opening to take people's money and give them their cigarettes, which I could not have been more thankful for. Several times this man came to visit, and he would leave to pump gas after staring at me awkwardly. About the 4th or 5th time, after I thought that he had left, I heard a knock on the other side of the barn on the glass. And there he was, face pressed against the glass, staring at me with this wide, manic grin, and waving at me with his fingers. It was enough to send me running for my manager when he left, demanding to go on break before I peed myself. The last time that I saw him, I will never forget though. It has been etched into my mind so deeply that I doubt bleach could scrub it away. He arrives as he usually did and orders his gas. This time, however, he reached through the hole in the glass and grabbed my hand before I could put the cash away in the cash register. It wasn't a violent grab, but it was firm enough to keep me from pulling away. Being a very sheltered 18-year-old, I froze in place. "I love you," he said, refusing to let go of my hand. I simply stared at him, unnerved and alarm bells ringing in my head. "Say it." "What?" I responded. "Say you love me." Naturally, I just wanted this guy to go away. And being so freaking scared out of my mind at this point of him, I stammered and I said it out of impulse. Maybe he would let me go and go away. "I love you," I said uneasily. "Call me if you need anything." "What's my number?" he asked again. This threw me off completely, and the look on my face probably gave away my confusion, because he repeated himself, despite my stammering that I did not know. Finally, he said something that made my blood run cold. I felt like I was going to throw up. "It's 911. He winked. This guy was the sheriff deputy, the person that I would have to call if I got into any sort of trouble in town. The person that I would have to call if I had a medical emergency, or if someone tried to rob me. And he wouldn't let go of my hand. I just nodded, trying to keep myself from shaking bad enough for him to feel it. He had never pulled up in a police car or anything, but when I talked to my manager, she confirmed what he said as being true. Once he did let go of me and went on his way, I retreated to the back and demanded to be relieved from the gas station area. I didn't care. I did not want to see that guy ever again. Thankfully, we moved soon after, so I never had to. But I will never forget the leering grin that man gave me every single time he purchased gasoline. You would think moving away would be the end of the story, but no. It got even worse when I went to college, and you wouldn't think that would be the case considering I was in Galveston. I needed to go to my counselor to discuss a few things, and this usually involved about 30 minutes of chit-chat, as me and my counselor had become close while I was attending school. During one of these chats, which my father had attended due to him attending school in the same classes as it was in an effort to finally get his degree, I mentioned Onalaska, Texas, and how we had owned a lake house up there. Initially, the happy expression left my counselor's face. She informed me that she had been a social worker in that area for quite a few years. And suddenly my childhood playground took an extremely dark turn, and the sheriff at the gas station became a nightmare. Apparently that area was notorious for kidnappings and other horrible incidents. Whole neighborhoods, including police officers, were in on it, and it was common for people trying to out the incidents to either going missing or to be completely thrown out of the community through intimidation tactics. She proceeded to tell me of several cases she had worked on, careful to leave out confidential details, of course, including incidents of entire families being in on the whole mess. When I told her about the sheriff that I had encountered, she kind of paled and wouldn't tell me anymore, except that she wasn't surprised. The conversation went on for over an hour and a half, but it was enough to make me never want to return to the small town that I had called my childhood summer home, and vowed to never ever bring any children I might have in the future there. So did the guy that intercepted my walkie-talkie signal and tried to lure me onto his boat. And to the creepy sheriff, let's never meet again. For the love of God, please.